Imagine it is the spring of 1944. You are a pilot in the United States Army Air Forces, climbing into your P-47 Thunderbolt at an airfield in southern England. For months, you have flown escort for the heavy bombers, the B-17s and B-24s, pounding German industry. You have faced the Focke-Wulfs and the Messerschmitts, the seasoned Luftwaffe pilots defending their homeland. It has been brutal, but you have held your own. Now, word is spreading through the mess halls and briefing rooms. Rumors, whispers. The Germans have something new, something terrifying. A plane with no propeller. A plane that moves so fast, it seems to defy the laws of physics. A plane that tears through bomber formations before anyone can even react. This was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. By every measure of performance, it was the most advanced combat aircraft to see action in the Second World War. Faster than anything the Allies could put in the sky. Heavily armed. A lethal predator designed to hunt and kill. And it almost changed everything. If not for a series of catastrophic decisions, conflicting egos and desperate gambles, this jet might have given Hitler the air superiority he needed to halt the Allied bombing campaign in its tracks, or at least to drag the war out to a bloody, stalemated conclusion that could have reshaped history. What happened to the Me-262 is not just a story of technology. It is a story of genius wasted, of opportunity squandered, and of a weapon that arrived both too early and too late. 1:30 to 5 o'clock, background. To understand the Me-262, we have to go back to before the war even began. In April 1939, 5 months before the invasion of Poland, the German Ministry of Aviation issued a request for a jet aircraft capable of 1 hour's endurance and a speed of at least 530 miles per hour.
The Messerschmitt Company, under the direction of Willy Messerschmitt and design team leader Woldemar Vogt, began work on Project 1065.
The original design looked quite different from what would eventually fly. Early plans called for the engines to be buried in the wing roots.
But there was a problem, a big one.
The BMW 003 jet engines being developed were proving heavier than expected. As the design progressed through 1940, engineers realized they needed to shift the aircraft's center of gravity. Their solution was elegant and, in hindsight, revolutionary. They swept the outer wings backward by 18.5 degrees. This was not primarily for high-speed performance, as is often assumed. It was to balance the airplane. But that slight sweep would later prove critical.
The jet engine program, however, was in trouble.
And here we meet the first of our villains. Hermann Göring, chief of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, was supremely confident in 1940.
France had fallen. Britain was on its heels.
The war, Göring believed, would be over by 1941. Why pour resources into experimental engines when conventional aircraft would win the day? In February 1940, Göring ordered the development of jet engines to be effectively stopped. The program was slashed to just 35 engineers.
Think about that.
The most advanced aviation project on Earth was reduced to a skeleton crew because the second most powerful man in the Reich was suffering from fatal optimism. For 2 critical years, progress limped along. Meanwhile, Anselm Franz at Junkers was developing an alternative engine, the Jumo 004. It was this engine that would eventually power the Me-262. But the delays had cost Germany irreplaceable time. On April 18, 1941, the Me-262 V1 prototype took to the air for the first time.
But it was a strange sight.
With its BMW jets not ready, the aircraft flew with a nose-mounted Junkers Jumo 210 piston engine driving a propeller, a jet fighter pretending to be a conventional plane. It was a start, but only that. The real breakthrough came on July 18, 1942. Test pilot Fritz Wendel climbed into the Me-262 V3 at Lyceum Airfield near Gunzburg. This time, the aircraft was powered only by 2 Jumo 004 engines.
Wendel advanced the throttles.
The plane accelerated down the runway, but something was wrong. The tail-down attitude of the aircraft caused the jet exhaust to bounce off the tarmac, blanking out the elevators.
He couldn't rotate.
Wendel aborted the takeoff. The engineers analyzed the problem. They gave Wendel a risky solution. He would accelerate to about 112 miles per hour, then tap the brakes. This would dip the nose, raising the tail into clean air where the control surfaces could work. At 8:40 that morning, Wendel tried again. He hit the speed, tapped the brakes, and the nose dropped. The Me-262 lifted into the air. Aviation history had been made. The aircraft was a marvel. With a maximum speed of 540 miles per hour, later models would push 560. It was a full 120 miles per hour faster than the legendary P-51 Mustang. It climbed at nearly 4,000 feet per minute. Its armament was devastating. 4 30mm 108 Malawian Quachas cannons in the nose, capable of tearing apart a heavy bomber with just a few hits. Later versions would carry 24 R-4M folding fin rockets, each one powerful enough to down a B-17 with a single strike. Witnesses were stunned. The legendary ace Adolf Galland, who had 104 victories to his name, flew the Me-262 on May 22, 1943. After landing, he was effusive. He described the flight as like being pushed by an angel. He immediately confronted Göring and demanded that the Me-262 be given top priority for production. "This aircraft," Galland said, "is a gold mine." For a moment, it seemed things might move forward. Erhard Milch, now in charge of production, committed to mass-producing the Me-262 at the expense of the Me-209, a conventional piston-engine fighter that Willy Messerschmitt had been pushing. But the bureaucratic battles were far from over. As 1943 wore on, the strategic situation for Germany deteriorated. The Sixth Army had been destroyed at Stalingrad. The Allies had landed in Italy. And most critically, the combined bomber offensive was gathering strength. By day, American B-17s and B-24s struck deep into German territory. By night, British Lancasters and Halifaxes pounded German cities. The Luftwaffe was fighting a two-front air war and losing. The Me-262 could have been the answer. But technical problems continued to plague the program. The Jumo 004 engine was a masterpiece of necessity, but also a nightmare of unreliability. Germany was running out of strategic materials: chromium, molybdenum, nickel, titanium, tungsten. These were essential for building engines that could withstand the tremendous heat generated by a jet turbine. The Advanced Submarine Construction Program had higher priority for these materials. As a result, the production Jumo 004B engines were built with only about one-third of the required high-grade steel. The consequences were predictable. Turbine blades, made of inferior metal, failed frequently. Compressor stalls were common, especially if pilots advanced the throttles too quickly. The operational life of an engine was measured not in hundreds of hours, but in a shocking 10 to 25 hours. Many Me-262s were lost not to enemy action, but to engine failures and resulting accidents. The very technology that made the aircraft extraordinary also made it fragile. Then came the moment that would define the Me-262's legacy. On November 26, 1943, Adolf Hitler arrived at the Insterburg airfield in East Prussia to view a demonstration of new weapons. Among them was the Me-262. Hitler watched as the jet streaked across the sky, its howling engines unlike anything he had heard before.
He was impressed.
But Hitler's mind was elsewhere. He was obsessed with the coming Allied invasion of France, which he knew could come any day. He envisioned a scenario where Allied troops would be storming the beaches, and German bombers would sweep in at high speed, untouchable by enemy fighters, dropping their payloads directly onto the invasion forces. He wanted a lightning bomber, a Schnellbomber, that could strike terror into the enemy and turn the tide before a beachhead could be established. Turning to Göring, Hitler asked, "Can this aircraft carry bombs?" Göring, who understood little of the technical details, passed the question to Willy Messerschmitt. The ever-pragmatic Messerschmitt, knowing full well that no work had been done on a bomber version, saw an opportunity to please the Führer and secure his program. "Certainly, my Führer," he replied. "With a few weeks of modification, the Me-262 can carry a 1,000-kilogram bomb load." Hitler was delighted. He had found his lightning bomber. He ordered that the Me-262 be developed primarily as a bomber. And with that single conversation, the fate of the world's most advanced fighter was sealed. Now, historians have debated the impact of this decision for decades. Some argue that Hitler's interference has been exaggerated, that technical problems with the engines were the real cause of the delay, and that the bomber order only set production back by a matter of weeks. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which interviewed German officials after the war, concluded that the aircraft would not have been available significantly earlier regardless of Hitler's decision. But this misses the point. The damage was not just in weeks lost on a calendar. It was in focus, in priority, in the very concept of how the aircraft would be used. The Me-262 was designed as an interceptor. Its strengths, speed, rate of climb, heavy firepower, were perfect for destroying bombers. Its weaknesses, poor acceleration, vulnerability at low speeds, high fuel consumption, made it poorly suited for ground attack. By forcing the jet into a role it was never meant to play, Hitler ensured that when it finally did appear, it would appear in insufficient numbers, with inadequately trained pilots, and with tactics that wasted its potential. And yet, even with this handicap, the Me-262 might still have made a difference. But there were other forces at work. By mid-1944, the situation was critical. The D-Day landings had come and gone. On June 6, just weeks before Hitler's lightning bomber was finally ready, the Allies were ashore in France, and the Luftwaffe was being swept from the skies. On June 8, 2 days after the invasion, Hitler reiterated his order. Initial production of the Me-262 would be for the bomber version only. The first operational unit to receive the jet was Erprobungskommando 262, a test and evaluation unit formed at Lechfeld in Bavaria in April 1944. Its job was to develop tactics and train pilots. In July, command was given to one of Germany's greatest aces, Walter Nowotny, with 258 victories to his name. The unit was renamed Kommando Nowotny. Nowotny's pilots began flying combat missions in August 1944. Their experiences were a mix of triumph and frustration. When the Me-262 worked, it was unstoppable. In one engagement, 6 Me-262s encountered a formation of B-17s. In minutes, they shot down 15 of the heavy bombers. The 30mm cannon shells smashed through the fortress's defensive armor, and the jet speed meant the American gunners could barely track them. But the aircraft were chronically unreliable.
Engines failed.
Landing gear collapsed. Pilots, many of them rushed through abbreviated training, struggled to handle the jet's peculiarities. The Me-262's throttle response was slow. Pushing the throttles forward too quickly would cause the compressor to stall and the engines to flame out. At low speeds, the jet was sluggish and vulnerable, especially during takeoff and landing, when it was a sitting duck for Allied fighters. And the Allies had learned to exploit this. In September 1944, a young American pilot named Chuck Yeager was flying his P-51 Mustang when he spotted an Me-262 preparing to land. Yeager dove on the jet, which had its speed and altitude low, and shot it down. It was a pattern that would repeat itself. For all its speed, the Me-262 was at its most fragile when it was close to the ground. Throughout August and September 1944, Kommando Nowotny flew missions, claiming victories but suffering steady losses. By October, they had lost about 30 jets, many to mechanical failures, some to enemy action. On November 8, disaster struck. Nowotny himself took off to engage a formation of American bombers and fighters. He radioed that he had shot down 2 more, his 259th and 260th victories. Then his transmissions became garbled. Witnesses on the ground saw his Me-262 enter a dive and crash.
Walter Nowotny was dead.
Some said he fell to P-51s. Others blamed engine failure. Whatever the cause, the Luftwaffe had lost one of its finest. Kommando Nowotny was disbanded. But the Me-262 program continued. In early 1945, a new unit was formed under one of the most respected figures in German aviation, Adolf Galland. Jagdverband 44, or JV-44, was an elite formation composed of some of the most experienced aces still alive. Galland handpicked his pilots from units grounded by lack of fuel. They included names like Johannes Steinhoff, Heinrich Bahr, and Gerhard Barkhorn. These were men with hundreds of victories between them, and they were determined to show what the Me-262 could do when flown by experts. But it was too late. By February 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. The fuel situation was catastrophic. The synthetic fuel plants that produced Germany's aviation gasoline had been systematically destroyed by the very bombers the Me-262 was meant to stop. Many jets sat on airfields, fully operational but unable to fly for lack of fuel. Others were destroyed on the ground by strafing Allied fighters that roamed at will over German airspace.
Production, too, was a nightmare.
Me-262 components were built in a network of secret factories and forest workshops, using slave labor from concentration camps. At the Gusen subcamp of Mauthausen, prisoners with an average life expectancy of 6 months built the jets under brutal conditions. At the Riamog facility near Kala, a tunnel complex was carved into a mountain, with a short runway on top where completed jets were lifted by elevator and launched with rocket assistance. The contrast was stark. The most advanced fighter in the world, built by dying men in underground caves. Despite everything, about 1,430 Me-262s were completed by the end of the war. Of these, perhaps 300 actually reached combat units. The rest were destroyed by bombing, abandoned, or captured before they could fly. So, what did the Me-262 accomplish? The numbers are striking. German pilots flying the jet claimed 542 Allied aircraft shot down. Against this, they lost about 100 Me-262s in combat. That is a kill ratio of better than 5 to 1, extraordinary by any standard. If these numbers are even roughly accurate, they demonstrate what the jet could do in the hands of skilled pilots. But the context is critical. Most of those kills came in the final months of the war, when the Allies already dominated the skies. The 542 claims must be weighed against the overall strategic picture, the thousands of Allied bombers that continued to pound Germany, the thousands of tons of bombs that fell, the relentless advance of armies from east and west. The turning point, if we can call it that, was not a single battle or a single decision. It was the cumulative effect of too little, too late. The Me-262 appeared in numbers that were never sufficient to stem the tide. The fuel shortages meant that even when jets were available, they often could not fly. The pilot training program was rushed. Many Me-262 pilots went into combat with only a handful of hours in the type, making them vulnerable despite their advanced equipment. And the Allies adapted. They changed their tactics. They sent fighters to patrol over German airfields, waiting to pounce on jets as they struggled through the vulnerable phases of takeoff and landing. They targeted the fuel supply chain. They bombed the factories. The Me-262 was a sword, but the Allies broke the arm that wielded it. Consider the experience of JV-44 in April 1945. Operating from Munich Riem Airfield, Gallen's elite unit flew missions against the bomber streams whenever fuel allowed. On April 4, Steinhoff led a formation of Me-262s against American bombers. As they took off, an Allied fighter sweep caught them. Steinhoff's jet was hit. He managed to crash land, but his face was terribly burned, disfigured for life. It was a microcosm of the jet's entire history. Even the best pilots in the best jets could not escape the relentless pressure of Allied air superiority. Yet, even in those final weeks, the Me-262 continued to show its potential. On April 10, 1945, Me-262s shot down 10 Allied aircraft. On April 19, they claimed 15 more. These were death throes, not a sustained campaign. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, the Me-262 passed into history. But its influence was only beginning. The Allies had captured numerous examples, and both the Americans and Soviets rushed to study them. Chuck Yeager, the same pilot who had shot down a Me-262, would later fly a captured example, marveling at its advanced design. The Me-262 directly influenced the next generation of fighters. The North American F-86 Sabre, which would dominate the skies over Korea, incorporated design elements learned from German jets. So did the Soviet MiG-15, which would duel with the Sabre in the first jet-versus-jet air battles. The swept wing, the pod engines, the emphasis on speed, all these became standard features of jet fighters for decades to come. And what of them might have been? Could the Me-262 have won the war for Hitler? The answer, in the cold light of history, is almost certainly no. By the time the jet was ready in meaningful numbers, Germany was already beaten. The economic and industrial might of the Allies was overwhelming. The bombing campaign had crippled German production. The Soviet army was at the gates of Berlin. No single weapon could have reversed that. But that does not diminish the Me-262's significance. It was a leap forward, a glimpse of the future. It showed what air combat would become. And it stands as a testament to what German engineers achieved under impossible conditions, and as a warning of what happens when brilliant technology is mismanaged by flawed leadership. The jet that almost won the war for Hitler didn't fail because it wasn't good enough. It failed because it came too late, in too few numbers, and was asked to do the wrong job. And that failure shaped the entire post-war world. The Cold War jet arms race that followed was, in many ways, fought with the legacy of the Me-262. The technology that might have saved the Third Reich ended up arming its conquerors. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was a marvel of engineering, a machine years ahead of its time. It terrified Allied airmen who encountered it. It achieved kill ratios that any fighter pilot would envy. And yet, it could not change the course of history. Its story reminds us that wars are not won by weapons alone, but by strategy, production, training, and the courage of the men who fly and fight. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.